Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Do you know what holiday 66 countries are formally observing today and scores more are observing informally?
I do.
What's it called?
I believe it is the 1st of May or a worker holiday or...
Yeah, it's called International Workers' Day or May Day. And I think the irony of you, I don't know how the timing of this worked out, but the irony of you testifying before us today.
The chairman and I worked it out.
Rich indeed, given what you've said about worker voice, the importance of worker voice and power, and your actions on worker voice and power in society, which is what International Workers' Day actually represents. I want to talk to you about health and safety. Sunday was Worker Memorial Day, and from 2009 to 2016, every year, OSHA, or the Labor Department, had an observation of Worker Memorial Day. And as you pointed out earlier, it's not just money that shows your priorities, it's your actions and what you do. And so I think it's really unfortunate that you and your department have chosen not to have any events to observe this really solemn and important occasion where we remember workers who died on the job and recommit ourselves not to let that happen. And most of OSHA's regulatory focus under this administration seems to focus on rolling back protections for workers in general instead of increasing protection for workers, which is at odds with your mission. I was particularly upset about OSHA's rollback of its regulation that required employers to submit anonymous, aggregated injury and illness information to the agency, and that would then be made public. These data would have been extremely helpful for researchers looking at the causes of workplace injuries and illnesses, as well as measures to prevent them. But OSHA rescinded it earlier this year. I actually have a CRA on this issue, House Joint Resolution 44, disapproving the final rule of OSHA's of the OSHA Act titled Tracking of Workplace Injuries and Illnesses. So my question is, how do you justify this rollback of worker protections?
Congressman, thank you for the question. And first, let me just say, going to the first part of your comments, I took a look at the fatality and the injury and illness data for the past year, and more fatalities than anyone would want. But let me just note that the workplace is safer, that there were 43 fewer workplace fatalities. That
okay, I understand, but I have very little time. I need you to answer this question.
I understand, but you're talking about the emphasis on safety, and I do think it's important that to note that
maybe
the workplace
next year you'll observe it with an event. In any event, go ahead.
So the tracking issue, it's interesting. We're actually being sued by both the Chamber of Commerce's and the labor unions or labor on this side, because what we did is there are 3 different pieces of information that we obtained. And we said we want the aggregate data because it's important that we have the aggregate data so that we can target our enforcement efforts. So if a particular business has...
I'm sorry, I don't have time for you to tell a long story. Let me just be specific here. You rescinded this regulation, and did any worker group or union ask you to rescind the regulation, or only employers?
Congressman,
are you aware?
We rescinded the regulation in part. I'm not aware who may or may not have asked.
Okay, so no worker organization.
I can tell you both sides seem a little unhappy with our outcome because we are still collecting some of the data. We're just not collecting.
It's not a matter of collecting data. It's a matter of what you gather. It's not what they have to keep. It's what you pull together. You must be aware that the regulation that you rescinded would not have required employers to send confidential information into OSHA. And in fact, the database and computer forms that your employees created for employers does not even allow employers to send confidential information into the agency. So there was no way they could do so. So given all of this, how can you explain how worker confidentiality or those kind of concerns were even involved when you wouldn't have had the confidential information at all?
Congressman, was asking for very detailed information about workers' specific injury. If they lost, if they were injured, what part of the body was injured, whether they lost a part of their body.
Yeah, without that information, researchers couldn't do any effective work, could they, to figure out if it's, they wouldn't know about repetitive injuries to wrists or legs if you just made it so generic. Really, it's a question of basic science, and it seems to me that the record clearly shows that you're simply trying to give cover to employers with bad records. MSHA has obtained this information for decades. There have been zero problems with confidentiality with MSHA. Zero. Doing the same thing. So I'm very sorry that you're reducing your protections of workers in this way. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.